Welcome to the Wheat Zoomer Module 3, in which we will continue to discuss our mechanisms of intestinal permeability, but now we'll shift gears a little bit to explore the causes a little bit better in detail. So let's get started. So in this module, we'll be discussing the large role the intestinal microbiome plays in intestinal permeability and epithelial barrier integrity, and then we're going to move on to discuss some diet and lifestyle considerations that also affect the breakdown of barrier integrity, including gluten, but also the fat content of the diet, alcohol, lectins, and stress, all of which we are commonly asked about. So many people start out with a Wheat Zoomer on a new patient because it's rich with data. It helps the patient connect the dots between what they're eating and how they're living, and then how that's manifesting as symptoms or chronic disease. But if you are not already running gut Zoomers on your patients, on whom you order Wheat Zoomers, consider that bacterial dysbiosis is really the true root of the loss of barrier integrity, whether it's direct due to pathogen invasion or indirect due to the loss of commensal microorganisms that impart metabolite-mediated immune tolerance in the epithelial barrier. So that doesn't mean don't start with the Wheat Zoomer, because it is still an excellent test to start with, but consider that in many cases, ordering a gut Zoomer on a patient alongside a Wheat Zoomer will give you hundreds more data points on which to base your clinical assessments and interventions. One of the most important roles that the intestinal microbiome plays in immune function is the production of metabolites that increase or activate T-cell differentiation, which means more T-regs are produced, which means the police of the immune system are stronger and better able to keep order. Without adequate T-regs, our immune system has trouble distinguishing self from non-self, and we are at higher risk for developing autoimmune disorders, allergies, autism, and asthma, to name just a few of the more well-known inflammatory conditions connected to this ecosystem. Bacterial metabolites include more than just short-chain fatty acids too, though. So there are polyphenol compounds that bacteria convert into metabolites, and aryl hydrocarbons, which we learned about in the last module, that are produced that are also influence intestinal epithelial homeostasis. But we'll focus a little more today on the role of fiber fermentation and its byproducts on this T-cell differentiation in the epithelial layer. Probably one of the most foundational concepts to understand about the role of the microbiome in intestinal permeability and barrier integrity is the production of short-chain fatty acids from dietary fiber. Diets high in complex carbohydrates contain more fiber and therefore more fermentable substrates for bacteria to feed on and turn into beneficial metabolites. Short-chain fatty acids produced by the commensal microbes in the gut include butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Of these, butyrate is probably the most well-studied. However, all three are important to the intestinal immune system homeostasis. Each of these short-chain fatty acids has influence on T-cell differentiation through slightly different mechanisms, but the end result is the same. T-cell differentiation is basically the process by which naive T-cells become activated to perform a function. In the case of inflammatory response, naive T-cells become activated T-cells that then signal B-cells to produce cytokines, as well as participate in immunoglobulin-driven reactions. So that's where you get your IgG and IgA. This can be a good thing, such as in the case of a pathogen in the intestinal microbiome. However, if naive T-cells are allowed to differentiate into activated T-cells and trigger inflammation unchecked, this is obviously bad, and where we see the majority of inflammatory conditions arise in the GI tract, because there's nothing controlling that differentiation into inflammation. If, however, naive T-cells differentiate into T-regs and we have balance and order in the system, T-regs are the police of the immune system and produce anti-inflammatory interleukins, which suppress aberrant immune responses such as multiple food sensitivities. The food sensitivities are the end result of a lack of T-regs, and simply removing the foods to which a patient has formed antibodies does nothing to rebalance the system. The abundance of short-chain fatty acids available in the epithelial barrier is specifically positively correlated with T-cell differentiation because of the action that short-chain fatty acids have in binding to those G protein coupled receptors on the outside of naive T cells, dendritic cells, and T-regs. So we learned about those cell types in the last module. So now we're seeing here that those cellular receptors basically are grabbing this short-chain fatty acid, whether it's butyrate, propionate, or acetate, and the binding of that short-chain fatty acid to that cellular receptor is what causes this differentiation of T cells. Also, the absence of the binding of that short-chain fatty acid causes the differentiation of the naive T cell into an activated T cell rather than a T-reg. So there needs to be the right amount. We don't want to have too much or too little. Short-chain fatty acid concentration, specifically butyrate, is also correlated with lower rates of colon cancer and colitis as well. In addition to indirectly influencing barrier integrity through immune modulation of T-cell differentiation, the microbial contribution to barrier integrity also includes direct influence on the tight junction proteins such as zonulin. L. plantarum and L. rhamnosus, so these are lactobacilli of that genus, are well-known reinforcers of tight junction integrity by inducing toll-like receptors on the outside of intestinal epithelial cells, which in turn signal for the increased abundance of zonulin into the tight junction, which reinforces it and keeps it close to foreign proteins and antigens present in the lumen. Once again, short-chain fatty acids make an appearance in their ability to modulate this barrier integrity through metabolite binding. And in this case, it's through the Lipooxygenase activity pathway. We won't really get too deeply into that LOX pathway, but lipooxygenases are a series of enzymes that transform polyunsaturated fatty acids, so including EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid, into byproducts such as pro-resolving mediators. In humans and other mammals, some LOX enzyme activity can be inflammatory and can be inhibited or balanced by a variety of dietary polyphenols, such as caffeic acid, which is found commonly in curcumin, thyme, sage, mint, cinnamon. These are polyphenols that are able to inhibit the inflammatory cytokine or leukotriene production that results from the 5-LOX pathway, but don't inhibit the pro-resolving mediator effects of the enzyme. So we won't really get into too great a detail specifically on that, but just know that when short-chain fatty acids are abundant, they help to increase the amount of certain LOX enzymes that promote tight junction integrity by releasing cytokines and pro-resolving mediators into the tight junctions. So this is a great example of where diet and supplementation meet, but diet probably has a greater effect on tight junction integrity overall and over time than just supplementation alone. The key takeaways here are that dietary nutrients are powerful modulators of inflammatory response, and the abundance of certain keystone microbes participate or augment that immune modulation of the tight junctions and barrier integrity. While commensal microbes are necessary to fortify and strengthen the tight junctions, there's also the flip side of this microbial influence on the barrier in that pathogens and some pathobionts, which are commensal organisms that can be opportunistic or conditionally pathogenic, also have influence here. Various pathogens, of which enteroinvasive E. coli is just one, are able to actually alter the formation of tight junction proteins and actin filaments in the cellular cytoskeleton, which leads to greater permeability and the symptoms that accompany it. Lactobacillus plantarum, our superstar epithelial hero bacteria here, is able to counter the effects of that pathogen and work to restore immunomodulation and suppress the destruction of those tight junction and cytoskeleton proteins. L. plantarum and other commensal bacteria prevent this inflammation by primarily competitively inhibiting the adherence of these pathogens to the epithelium or mucosa, but also by, at times, producing AMPs, which are those antimicrobial peptides we kind of briefly touched on in the last module. Another key component to note here is not just the role that intestinal bacteria play in either modulation of the intestinal barrier and tight junctions, or inflammatory breakdown of those, but also in translocation across that barrier into circulation and the resulting inflammation they drive. It's well known that some intestinal pathobions and pathogens can translocate across a hyperpermeable intestinal barrier, and once they do, they have been strongly linked to atherosclerosis, autoimmunity of the joints, as well as internal organ inflammation. Whenever zonulin levels are elevated, there is increased access to systemic circulation for those pathogens or pathobionts. But remember that those microbes can also cause increased release of zonulin away from the tight junctions, which causes that permeability to a greater extent. The takeaway here is to monitor not just the status of your patient's intestinal permeability by rechecking their Wheat-Zoomer or intestinal permeability panel at least every 6 months, if not every 90 days, but to also monitor other systemic labs such as lipid panels, cardiovascular inflammation panels, and hepatic function for abnormalities or trending patterns of inflammation increase. Here's just another interesting study that showed that exposure to certain enterobacteria, regardless of how pathogenic or supposedly harmless the species, increased release of zonulin away from the tight junctions and increased permeability as the transepithelial electric resistance decreased and with less zonulin present. And this demonstrates the influence that zonulin has on the tight junctions undoubtedly, but should also continue to solidify that zonulin is not just a marker of gluten sensitivity, but it's more likely to be a marker of exposure to overgrown commensal microbes, such as a bloom of a bacterial colony that has just overgrown, or pathogenic microorganisms in the lumen of the intestines. So in addition to the effects that pathogenic bacteria have on zonulin, there's also this effect on the actin cytoskeleton, which we learned in the last module is responsible for holding together the structure of the cell, as well as the adherens junctions. When actin filaments are destroyed by pathogenic toxins, the cell itself becomes damaged or leaky, and permeability is now not just paracellular between the cells, but intracellular through the damaged cells. Again, it's important to note here that we are talking about the influence that overgrowths of opportunistic and pathogenic bacteria have on cellular and barrier integrity, totally independent of the mechanism of gluten-mediated permeability. Now, we've covered pretty thoroughly how tight junction and cytoskeleton proteins can be affected by bacteria, but we should also note that there are other things that affect these structural modulators of barrier integrity, and one of those things is surfactants. Surfactants are food additives that are used primarily as emulsifying agents. Emulsifiers are chemicals that allow fats and water to mix in the same medium and generally are not problematic. However, when they are also classified as surfactants, they can actually cause a decrease in that TEER, or transepithelial electric resistance, which increases permeability of the barrier and allows for translocation through the tight junctions, breakdown of the actin filament chain, and even shortening of the microvilli in some individuals. We'll cover a list of surfactants in Module 4, where we dive into specific interventions for healing the intestinal barrier. Again, this is to bring up just the multiple mechanisms behind increased barrier breakdown and permeability and give you some directions to work on with patients who need some extra help in complex cases of intestinal permeability, such as autoimmunity, for instance. Next on the intestinal permeability panel, you'll find LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. In the last module, we learned that this is a common endotoxin and is produced only by gram-negative bacteria. Its role on the cell membrane is of those bacteria that carry it, is to act as a barrier to their surroundings. So essentially, it's a sort of protective coat that they wear, if you want to think of it that way. It is recognized by the immune system as a marker for detection of bacterial pathogen invasion. So our cells that are constantly sensing what's going on, remember we learned about our dendritic cells in the last module, as well as M cells, they can sense this LPS, they pick it up or they recognize it as that bacterial foreign protein. So it can definitely trigger immune responses. Even in the lumen, but especially once it gets into circulation. It's responsible for the development of that inflammatory response. It's basically the thing that triggers that. So AMPs, which are those antimicrobial peptides that are produced by commensal microorganisms, as well as by the host, humans also produce these. These are actually known to interact with LPS with very high affinity, which is a good thing. We definitely want that mechanism to work. There's also a really strong connection between the intestinal microbiome and metabolic rate, nutrient absorption and assimilation, and then appetite, influence, and regulation. And this connection really goes both ways. But here's an example of how something as simple as chronic caloric overload coupled with low fiber intake from plants selects for a different composition of microbes, which increases intestinal permeability by impairing tight junction control. Once those tight junctions are no longer as functional, microbes and their endotoxins, so we're talking about LPS here, however, you have to also realize that gram-positive bacteria produce an endotoxin called lipoteichoic acid. So LPS is the one that most people focus on, but realize that gram-positive bacteria, even a lot of our commensal microorganisms that are helpful, still produce endotoxins. These can translocate across the barrier, driving up inflammation, immune responses, changing the way our liver and our adipose tissues signal, as well as the way they store nutrients. So this same process can yield insulin resistance and leptin resistance, which then results in the loss of some measure of appetite regulation through both the hypothalamic pathway as well as the gut secretion of peptides and hormones like GLP-1 or PYY. The takeaway here is when you see antibodies to LPS on the wheat Zoomer's intestinal permeability panel, you want to think potential risk for metabolic derangement, risk for metabolic syndrome, and appetite dysregulation. If your patient is not obese or overweight and doesn't have diabetes or cardiovascular disease or hasn't had a stroke, that's okay. And those are great things, by the way. Just think that, okay, with LPS, these are the risk factors that are connected. And if there's a family history of those for that patient, just another layer of risk added to that patient's, medical profile. This slide should look familiar if you've tuned into our Gut Zoomer Module 1 of the Gut Zoomer educational webinar. We spent some quality time discussing the role that short-chain fatty acids play in modulating immune responses in the intestinal epithelium. And they're quite critical to the balance of T-cell differentiation, as well as fuel for colonocytes. Those are our enterocytes in the colon. They become even more important in individuals with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis who have improper immune responses to many of their commensal bacteria and who tend to have a deficit of butyrate present in the colon. And it is that, in fact, that deficit of butyrate that is what causes that incorrect immune response to commensal bacteria because there isn't enough T-cell differentiation happening. The relationship between short-chain fatty acids and intestinal permeability is where we have a nice discussion about the abundance of short-chain fatty acid producing bacteria. And those inhabit the mucosa. When we see inadequate populations of those, such as on the intestinal permeability panel on the Gut Zoomer, then we can start to piece together patterns of cause and effect. Without enough of those microbes, we're more likely to see a weak or even absent mucosal layer in some places where intestinal epithelial cells are exposed to everything in the intestinal lumen and which are constantly inflamed and under attack, even by commensal microbes. So again, keep in mind that we like Lactobacillus and we like Bifidobacterium, but they, for the most part, still cannot come in contact with our intestinal epithelial cells because they are still a foreign body or a foreign, protein, for lack of a better word, is what our immune cells are recognizing as their foreign proteins. And they are going to trigger immune responses if they come in contact with our cells. And so that mucosal layer is critical for acting as that barrier for these commensal microbes to live in and survive and help us out without actually touching us, if you think of it that way. Knowing whether your patient has a decreased abundance of those short-chain fatty acid producers can help you craft a more personalized intervention for them to heal and seal the intestinal barrier and reseed the microbiome to prevent further dysbiosis. And essentially that's kind of the key to healing the gut lining. If you have this dysbiosis present, it doesn't matter what kind of supplements you throw at someone. If you don't resolve what's underlying, whether it's, dysbiosis of commensal microorganisms or pathogens present, it's going to keep coming back. All right, next we'll talk briefly about some causes of increased intestinal permeability that relate to dietary intake and whether you should consider those when creating interventions or how they may show up on the Wheat-Zoomer panels. Okay, so the big one that everybody usually goes to first is gluten, or more specifically, gliadin. Gliadin is the peptide fragment of gluten that is usually most immunologically reactive in those with celiac and gluten sensitivity. Glutenin is another peptide that binds to gliadin to form the gluten complex, but today we'll just discuss gliadin's role in intestinal permeability. It's well established at this point that gliadin's binding of cellular receptors on intestinal epithelial cells increases the release of zonulin away from the tight junction and increases permeability. If your patient's results have either elevated zonulin levels or elevated anti-zonulin antibodies, consider that this mechanism may be at play, especially if there are also anti-gliadin antibodies elsewhere on the test results. Now, it's important to note here that if you remember our previous discussion of causes of things that elevate zonulin, gliadin is just one, and you may certainly still have dysbiosis present and also have a gluten sensitivity. But if all you run is a Wheat-Zoomer, you won't know whether you do have dysbiosis and which type it is. The Wheat-Zoomer alone will only tell you if there is intestinal permeability and give you some paths to follow to assess for additional testing if you haven't run it alongside the Wheat-Zoomer. Another dietary consideration here when we talk about intestinal permeability is the overall fat or lipid content of meals. Increased fat loads at meals increases permeability, and if a patient has gram-negative dominated dysbiosis with or without antibodies to LPS on the Wheat-Zoomer, because LPS is fat-soluble, it's going to follow the fat during absorption and will translocate across the intestinal barrier more easily, driving up systemic inflammation in those individuals. Now, how would you know if you have a gram-negative dominant dysbiosis? The Gut-Zoomer can give you this information. If you've run it with the Wheat-Zoomer, you've got a really nice set of labs to look at, but if not, you want to consider that factor before placing a patient on a ketogenic diet or even on a low-carb, high-fat diet that's not technically ketogenic. Just realize that the more fat you have a patient consuming with LPS, or even in the absence of LPS, if they have gram-negative dominant dysbiosis, you run the risk of translocation of LPS across the intestinal barrier. In addition to the previously mentioned role that higher fat meals have in increasing the translocation of LPS across the intestinal barrier, higher fat meals consistently over time, so more like a generally higher fat diet or ketogenic diet long term, actually suppress beneficial microbe populations such as bifidobacteria. Bifidobacteria play a critical role in reducing endotoxin access to systemic circulation, and the more of them you have, the less endotoxins you have entering circulation. If the abundance of these bacteria is suppressed with higher fat diets, you add a double layer of risk to endotoxins entering the bloodstream and the inflammatory response that results. Now, if you run a Gut-Zoomer alongside a Wheat-Zoomer and see that bifidobacteria are adequate or optimal, there may be little to no risk in implementing a higher fat diet temporarily, but keep in mind that over time, that higher fat diet can begin to inhibit the growth of bifidobacteria, causing more problems later on for that patient. Next, we have alcohol. You may notice that perhaps sometimes patients are more reluctant to forgo their adult libations than they are to give up gluten. And this can, of course, be a difficult conversation to have, particularly because of the role that alcohol tends to play in emotional medicating and stress management for some individuals. Alcohol may be a problem for some individuals, especially if you see elevations of zonulin or antibodies to zonulin, as this can be an exacerbation of existing derangement of barrier integrity. It might be the cause, but it might also be one of many causes. In addition to having effects on zonulin in the tight junction, alcohol also causes the redistribution of actin in the cytoskeleton. So how much alcohol causes this? This particular study used 20 grams of ethanol, which would equal about 2 glasses of wine that are of 12.5% alcohol by volume. That's approximately 1 to 2 shots of liquor or 3 to 4 beers, depending on their percent ABV. Could someone theoretically limit alcohol to 1 glass of a dark red wine per night? Maybe this is a call on the part of the practitioner to assess the whole picture and decide if the benefits of the polyphenol content of the red wine, which we'll discuss more in depth in the next module, outweigh the potential inflammation in that specific patient's case. Now, like I said, this is going to be a consideration for some patients, but not all. Not everybody drinks very much, and some people who drink an occasional glass of wine are probably not looking at alcohol as a major mediator of this barrier integrity loss. And then topically, because lectins have made a resurgence in the integrative space as potential contributors to intestinal permeability, as well as the release of Vibrant's new lectin zoomer, we should acknowledge that at least one lectin, wheat germ agglutinin, has the ability to impair the epithelial barrier and increase permeability, especially in the presence of gliadin, which will basically always be present when one consumes wheat and wheat germ agglutinin. For this reason, antibodies to WGA on the wheat zoomer can be both an indication of an immune response to wheat germ agglutinin and another marker of increased intestinal permeability. Antibodies to WGA should definitely be considered reason to fully eliminate wheat from a patient's diet, as well as initiate a gut healing protocol. And finally, the element of intestinal permeability that often gets overlooked and ignored in a patient's workup, as well as by the patients themselves. Elevated cortisol responses have been shown to increase permeability at the tight junctions, actin remodeling, and decreased expression of zonulin in the tight junctions. It is critical in any intestinal permeability healing protocol that sources of stress are identified and addressed, because even the best supplement protocol cannot put out the fires that dumping cortisol on the intestinal epithelial barrier will start and keep fanning. Stress management may include referring out to mental health professionals or a counselor, meditation and breathing exercises, yoga, journaling, adoption of positive hobbies, and even addressing toxic people, places, and things in the patient's life beyond just diet. Not all of these will fall within your scope or experience usually, so it's important to have a network for referring patients to the resources they need in these cases to ensure that there is appropriate accountability for this element of healing. Okay, so now that we've covered root causes, let's just briefly summarize the list of the most common causes of intestinal permeability outside of just gluten. For sure, gluten can absolutely be a contributor to the tight junction and intracellular permeability we see on wheat zoomer reports. But in light of all the other causes of increased permeability, keep in mind how all of these other factors may be at play in your patient's case when interpreting their wheat zoomer and their medical history alongside it. And certainly, you could have several or even all of these elements affecting the permeability of your patient's epithelial lining. And that's why it's important to look at more than just the wheat zoomer. At a minimum, a gut zoomer is recommended to assess the status of dysbiosis underlying the epithelial layer breakdown, as well as hormone panels that include cortisol and a thorough diet history or record of what your patient's typical nutritional intake is like. All right, so that concludes Module 3 of the Wheat Zoomer. Up next, we have Module 4, where we'll actually answer the questions, what do I actually do about this, and what kind of gut healing protocol is appropriate for my patient? Thanks for joining us.